It's late summer and I'm again using insect netting to protect my crops, but not just from insects. In today's video, I'm going to demonstrate to you why I use it, what the difference is between insect netting and floating row cover, and why this is an essential part of practicing an organic garden.
First of all, let's talk about the differences between insect netting and floating row cover. As you can see, the insect netting is much more lightweight, whereas the floating row cover is thicker. And there's reasons for that because they serve different purposes. The insect netting actually lets more light in, depending on what kind of insect netting you choose. Most of the time, it lets almost all of the light into your garden. Floating row cover, on the other hand, blocks some portion of the light. It depends on what kind of floating row cover you get, but anywhere between 25 to 50% blockage of light is normal with floating row cover. Now, you may think, okay, that's nice. I could have some shade on my garden, especially in the summer and the early fall, but that actually can work against you because if you're covering your entire garden with floating row cover, it actually heats up almost like a greenhouse. Now, in the fall and in the winter and in the early spring, that's actually what you want. You want that heat to be trapped. But in the summertime and in the late summer, early fall, when heat is pretty bad, you don't want that heat to be trapped. Next, let's take a look at how I use insect netting, specifically in the summer and also going into the early part of fall. Insect netting provides protection of seedlings that are susceptible in many cases to beetles, grasshoppers, rabbits. That's why I'm using it here for beans. I have noticed over the years that when I plant early plantings of beans, usually those beans can get to a good size before they start being attacked by a lot of those pests. But in the later part of the summer, those pests are brutal. Like I said, the big ones are going to be beetles of some sort. There are lots of them that are attacking my beans, but then also grasshoppers. And then this time of year, I do have problems sometimes with rabbits getting in the fence. I don't know how they keep getting in the fence, but a lot of times what they'll do first thing is they go for the young seedlings. Once the beans and any other plants get to be a decent height, the rabbits aren't going to bother them. But early on, I definitely want to protect the seedlings from any rabbits that figure out a way to breach my fence. Now, as you see me working on this garden here, you can see that my beans have already sprouted. Ideally, this cover would have gone on at the time of planting, but life got in the way. I didn't get the cover on in time. We got a lot of rain and the beans sprouted really fast. So now I'm trying to get the cover on now. But as you can see here, the pests have already attacked. My hope is that by adding the cover now, it'll still provide some measure of protection against the beetles and the grasshoppers. Although sometimes I notice the grasshoppers get in anyway, but not near in the amount that they would have if the garden was uncovered. And then of course, this will definitely protect from rabbits. What I'm showing you here is my protection of these bean seedlings, but I also use insect netting in other times of the year for other crops. In the spring and late summer, protection is essential for brassicas against the cabbage worm moth. This is the moth that lays her eggs that hatch out into cabbage worms, whether that's the cabbage looper or the cross-striped cabbage worms, which I found are the worst for me in the fall. But the problem is if that moth is able to get on your brassica plants, there's very little you can do about it. You can handpick, you can spray BT, but I found that just excluding the area altogether where the moth can't get to my brassicas, that's the best choice. In the midsummer, I also use insect netting to protect my young squash plants from the squash vine borer moth. Very similar to the cabbage moth, this moth lays its eggs on the squash itself. The difference is that these little grubs bore into the stem and they will eventually cause death to the plant. So what I found that I can do to help that is to protect the squash while they're young. And then once they start flowering, I can either make the decision to take off the insect netting while I hand pollinate every morning and then put it back on, or I can take it off and then hope I get a certain amount of harvest before the squash vine borer gets there. But what I've noticed too is that the later plantings of squash tend to be less affected by the squash vine borer. So eventually I can take the insect netting off and not have to worry about it and then let the pollinators pollinate those flowers. That's what happened last year and I had a great harvest at the end of the season, which I talk more about in this video. As you can see, I'm covering 2 particular beds today with insect netting, and just for demonstration purposes, I'm showing you the options of having a lower hoop and a larger hoop. So in the first bed, I'm using the super hoops from Gardener Supply. I used to make my own out of PVC, and I just didn't really love the function and how they looked. And honestly, I either had to choose a 3-foot or a 4-foot, and they weren't really interchangeable. So I like how these hoops from Gardener Supply can be used for different sizes. But what I did on the first bed is I used one of those hoops to span the width of the bed. This is ideal for small crops like bean seedlings or lettuce. It's really made to be more functional with a 3-foot wide bed, and I found that does work better, but this bed is a 4-foot wide bed and it works okay too. It's just a little bit lower to the ground. The challenge with this method is that these beans will grow taller than this netting is, and so they'll reach the top and they'll eventually need more room. So for the taller crops like broccoli and squash in particular, I don't even bother with one. I'll just do the larger one in the beginning. And for this first bed, that's what I'll do as well. I'll eventually add the second one to get a little bit more. For the second bed, you can see that that's exactly what I do. I'm using 2 of the super hoops that are connected by inline connectors. And the benefit here is that you can have more room for larger plants to grow, whether that's these bush beans that'll need a little bit more room, or your broccoli or squash or anything else you use. The drawback here is that in my 4-foot bed, my 8-foot wide insect netting barely covered it, so I had some gaps. I just wasn't able to get it perfect. And so this isn't ideal. I think this would be a bigger issue if I had broccoli under here, because the cabbage moth a lot of times can figure out how to get in those gaps. I did have that happen last year. But in my 3-foot bed, when I've done this in the past, it worked perfectly with my 8-foot wide insect netting. I will probably end up ordering a 10-foot wide insect netting so that I can use that on my 4-foot beds just to make sure I have complete coverage. That's the thing about using insect netting, is that it can be a little bit imperfect if you're covering against rabbits or things like that. But if you're talking about a cabbage worm, you really have to make that place Fort Knox for those things not to get in. The more you can cover it, obviously, the better it's going to be when it comes to covering against insects.
When you use insect netting as part of your organic garden practice, not only does it exclude pests, but if that's effective, you don't have to worry about spraying. And also it protects from wildlife. So rabbits are not getting in here to eat my crops when they're young. So not only does it help to exclude pests, but also wildlife that threaten your garden. An additional benefit of going ahead and setting up insect netting on your raised beds is that when you decide to convert to a fall garden, you can easily attach shade cloth on top of what's already there. I've made the mistake of using shade cloth by itself to try to do dual purpose, shading and excluding, but it never really worked. And I found that even with shade cloth, if I put it all the way around the bed like this, it trapped the hot air and it really wasn't good for my crops. So the way that I use shade cloth in addition to insect netting is I'll just drape it over, often on the south side, and then keep the north side open for airflow. I found that to be the perfect combination of using insect netting and shade cloth in the fall. While we would all rather not have to worry about the hassle of creating an exclusion barrier method like this is much better in my opinion than hand picking and spraying and fighting pests, and also walking out into your garden and seeing that Peter Rabbit once again breached your fence. I've been there, done that, and it's heartbreaking, especially when you've worked so hard to grow your seedlings. And even though it takes a little bit of setup, the good news is these tools can be used season after season. The links to what I'm using here are down in the description. If you haven't tried insect netting to exclude pests and wildlife from your garden, I highly recommend you give it a try, and I think you'll find out that it's well worth the effort.